Like and subscribe for more makeup content.
This is 1984, written by George Orwell, narrated by Adriel Brandt. Part 1, Chapter 1. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. Always smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for
listening to 1984.
It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times,
if you feel like anybody might want to listen to it,
electric current
share away.
Like ours.
Definitely tap the screen if you can.
It was part of the economy drive in preparation.
I feel like a lot of people need to hear this.
The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right hand,
I might come on camera eventually and clean off my makeup and stuff, and do some fresh makeup just for you guys in a little square. But yeah,
the poster with the enormous face.
For now, we're just gonna listen and enjoy.
It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eye
can you hear it okay?
When you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures,
Let me know if
which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came
Welcome everyone, tap the screen, share the live. We are listening to George Orwell's 1984.
Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. Moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Inside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue,
let me know in the comments if you guys think that the thought police are real nowadays.
That were plastered everywhere.
That'd be nice.
The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word, Ingsoc. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a bluebottle, and darted away again with a curve in flight. It was the police patrol.
We're heading in that direction.
The patrols did not matter, however.
Yeah, we're definitely headed in that direction.
Police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the 19-year plan.
Even now I'm worried that they might take this live down.
The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously.
Because they're literally watching.
Any sound that Winston made, above the level of a very low whisper, would be picked up by it.
Nowadays, Big Brother is AI.
So long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live, They live from
If you have like an auto clicker and you don't want to tap the screen, you can like set the auto clicker to tap.
Except in darkness.
They're free to download as apps, and you can set it to like unrecognizable or something like that. So that way, like the algorithm doesn't recognize it, but you can still be tapping the screen. That way, it gets people in here.
The Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought with a sort of vague distaste. This was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with vaults of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions? And the bomb sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herb straggled over the heaps of rubble, and the places where the bombs had cleared a larger patch, and there had sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings.
This is for educational purposes only.
But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood, except a series of bright-lit tableaux.
I might have to mention that every time they say BOMB.
And mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, Mini-True in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other building in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on its white face in elegant lettering.
I just got an unstable connection notification. Did it skip or freeze for you at all?
Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Ministry of Truth contained, it was said,
like I'm on my Wi-Fi.
Rooms above ground level and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size.
I'm still here.
So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victory Mansions, you could see all 4 of them simultaneously.
Did it freeze?
They were the homes of the 4 ministries.
TikTok gave me a notification that
of government was
I don't have connection.
The Ministry of Truth,
like I'm
concerned
here.
itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war.
Yeah, you got that tapper. I love you. Keep in mind you can't comment when you have that on, so like you have to like pause it and type if you want to type, but I appreciate this.
Their names in Newspeak, Mini-True, Mini-Pants,
I appreciate it.
and Plenty.
I use it so much for other lives.
The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one.
Ministry of Love.
There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun nests. The streets leading up to its outer barriers were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with jointed truncheons. Winston turned round abruptly. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the ministry at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid with a plain white label marked Victory Gin. It gave off a sickly, oily smell, as of Chinese rice spirit. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shot.
Fair reminder, there may be some outdated language as well in this, as it was written in the 1940s.
His face turned scarlet, and the water ran out of his eyes. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, One had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down, and the world began to look more cheerful. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victory Cigarettes, and incautiously held it upright, whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen.
So there's 5 books over there.
From the table drawer, he took out
this one will be one for sure.
A bottle of ink and a thick.
I'm going to buy it and paperback.
With red back.
Get the Constitution if you don't have one already, because they have already deleted it off the website.
For some reason, the telescreen...
They don't have it on the website anymore.
Position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, in the end wall...
Also, reproductiverights.org has been erased as well.
Opposite the window. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove, in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was of a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. It seemed lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town. Just what quarter he did not now remember, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops, dealing on the free market it was called, but the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things, such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. Given a quick glance up and down the street, and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase. Even with nothing written in it, it was a compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures, and he had procured one, furtively and with some difficulty, simply because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib, instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the speakwrite, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink, and then faltered for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decisive act. In small, clumsy letters he wrote, April 4th, 1984.
Hey Kirsten, how are you, girl?
He sat back.
What kind of listen to depressing
shit? A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984.
Yeah,
it must be round about that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two.
I know.
For whom, it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary?
I'm sorry.
For the future. For the unborn. His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word doublethink. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was, of its nature, impossible. Either the future would resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to you, or it would be different from it.
Thank you for
and his
liking the
prediction
live.
would be
I appreciate
meaningless.
that. If you have an auto tapper, you can turn that on and it'll tap for you.
For some time he sat, gazing stupidly at the paper. Telescreen had changed over to Strident
just changed on here. I don't know how to do
It was
this.
curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say.
Screen.
For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment.
Would this work?
And it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. Actual writing would be easy.
Oh, I can move.
All he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable restless
phone is really hot right now. I don't know why.
Literally for years.
So I hope it doesn't shut off.
At this moment,
Also, we are in my bathroom.
Even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it always became a flame.
I'm just gonna get this.
The seconds were ticking by. Conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the itching of the skin above his ankle, the blaring of the music, and a slight ooziness caused by the gin. Suddenly he began writing in shorthand, only imperfectly aware of what he was setting down. His small but childish handwriting straggled up and down the page, shedding first its capital letters, and finally on its full stops.
Oh my god.
April 4th, 1984. Last night to the flicks. All war films. One very good one of a ship full of refugees being bombed somewhere in the Mediterranean.
I'm gonna clean my
Audience
face.
much amused by shots of a great huge fat man trying to swim away with a helicopter after him. First you saw him wallowing along in the water like a porpoise. Then you saw him through the helicopter's gun sights. Then he was full of holes, and sea round him turned pink, and he sank as suddenly as though the holes had let in the water. Audience shouting with laughter when he sank.
Do you guys want to see a makeup look while we listen to
We
this?
saw a lifeboat full of children with a helicopter hovering over it. There was a middle-aged woman, might have been a Jewess, sitting up in the bow with a little boy about 3 years old in her arms. Little boy screaming with fright, and hiding his head between her breasts, as if he was trying to burrow right into her, and the woman putting her arms around him and comforting him, although she was blue with fright herself, all the time covering him up as much as possible as if she thought her arms would keep the bullets off him. Then the helicopter planted a 20-kilo bomb in among them, terrific flash, and the boat went all the matchwood. Then there was a wonderful shot of a child's arm going up, right up into the air. A helicopter with a camera in its nose must have followed it up, and there was a lot of applause from the party seats. But a woman down in the pool part of the house suddenly started kicking up a fuss, and shouting they didn't oughter have showed it. Not in front of kids, they didn't. It ain't right, not in front of kids, it ain't. Until the police turned her out. I don't suppose anything happened to her. Nobody cares what the proles say. Typical prole reaction, they never. Winston stopped writing, partly because he was suffering from cramp. He did not know what had made him pour out this stream of rubbish.
How are you?
But the curious thing was that while he was doing so, a totally different memory had clarified itself in his mind, to the point where he almost felt equal to writing it down.
Judy! Long time ago.
It was, he now realized, because of this other incident, that he had suddenly decided to come home and begin the diary today. It happened that morning at the ministry, if anything so nebulous could be said to happen. It was nearly 1100, and in the records department, where Winston worked, they were dragging the chairs out of the cubicles and grouping them in the center of the hall opposite the big telescreen, in preparation for the 2 minutes hate.
I'll just use a wet wipe.
Winston was just taking his place in one of the middle rows, when 2 people whom he knew by sight, but had never spoken to, came unexpectedly into the room.
I gotta get my makeup from downstairs.
One of them was a girl, whom he often passed in the corridors. He did not know her name, but he knew that she worked in the fiction department.
Right?
Presumably, since he had sometimes seen her with oily hands and carrying a spanner, she had some mechanical job on one of the novel-writing machines. She was a bold-looking girl, about 27, with thick hair, a freckled face, and swift athletic movements. A narrow scarlet sash, emblem of the Junior Anti-Sex League, was wound several times round the waist of her overalls, just tightly enough to bring out the shapeliness of her hips.
I'm back.
Winston had disliked her from the very first moment of seeing her. He knew the reason. It was because of the atmosphere of hockey field and cold baths and community hikes, and general kindness which she managed to carry about with her. He disliked nearly all women, and especially the young and pretty ones. It was always the women, and above all the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and nosers out of unorthodoxy. But this particular girl gave him the impression of being more dangerous than most. Once when they passed in the corridor, she gave him a quick sidelong glance, which seemed to pierce right into him, and for a moment had filled him with black terror. The idea had even crossed his mind that she might be an agent of the thought police.
Oh, okay.
That, it was true, was very unlikely.
He's just paranoid.
Still, he continued to feel a peculiar uneasiness, which had fear mixed up in it as well as hostility, whenever she was anywhere near him. The other person was a man named O'Brien, a member of the inner party and holder of some post so important and remote that Winston had only a dim idea of its nature. A momentary hush passed over the group of people round the chairs as they saw the black overalls of an inner party member approaching.
Also, let me know if it freezes at any point.
Was a large, burly man.
Comment that it froze, and I'll just reset my
brutal face.
Because my phone likes to do that.
In spite of his formidable appearance, he had a certain charm of manner. Had a trick of resettling his spectacles on his nose, which was curiously disarming.
All right, good night.
In some indefinable way, curiously civilized. It was a gesture which, if anyone had still thought in such terms, might have recalled an 18th century nobleman offering his snuff-box. Winston had seen O'Brien perhaps a dozen times in almost as many years. He felt deeply drawn to him, and not solely because he was intrigued by the contrast between O'Brien's urbane manner and his prize-fighter's physique. Much more, it was because of a secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. And again, perhaps it was not even unorthodoxy that was written in his face, but simply intelligence. But at any rate, he had the appearance of being a person you could talk to, so somehow you could cheat the
found in some drugstores as well. They're pretty cheap. I can't afford Sephora.
The smallest effort to verify this guess. Indeed, there was no way of doing so.
So yeah.
This moment, O'Brien glanced at his wristwatch, saw that it was nearly 1100.
Got a wet nice sponge. The blending
until the
side
date was over. He took a chair in the same row as Winston, a couple of places away. A small, sandy-haired woman who worked in the next cubicle to Winston was between them. The girl with dark hair was sitting immediately behind. The next moment, a hideous, grinding speech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. The little sandy-haired woman gave a squeak of mingled fear and disgust. Goldstein was the renegade and backslider who once, long ago, how long ago nobody quite remembered, had been one of the leading figures of the party, almost on a level with Big Brother himself, and then had engaged in counter-revolutionary activities, had been condemned to death, and had mysteriously escaped and disappeared. Programs of the 2 Minutes Hate varied from day to day, but there was none in which Goldstein was not the principal figure. He was the primal traitor, the earliest defiler of the party's purity. All subsequent crimes against the party, all treacheries, acts of sabotage, heresies, deviations, sprang directly out of his teaching. Somewhere or other he was still alive and hatching his conspiracies, perhaps somewhere beyond the sea, under the protection of his foreign paymasters. Perhaps even, so it was occasionally rumored, in some hiding place in Oceania itself. Winston's diaphragm was constricted. He could never see the face of Goldstein without a painful mixture of emotions. It was a lean Jewish face, with a great fuzzy aureole of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable, with a kind of senile silliness in a long, thin nose, near the end of which a pair of...
So that was the elf concealer?
It resembled the face of a sheep, and the voice too had a sheep-like quality.
I wish I could see the name. But it's like super light.
His usual venomous attack upon the doctrines of the party. An attack so exaggerated and perverse that a child should have been able to see through it.
In coconut
and
for my
yet,
contour.
Just plausible enough to fill one with an alarmed feeling that other people, less level-headed than oneself, might be taken in by it. He was abusing Big Brother. He was denouncing the dictatorship of the party. He was demanding the immediate conclusion of peace with Eurasia. He was advocating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought. He was crying hysterically that the revolution had been betrayed. And all in this rapid polysyllabic speech, which was a sort of parody of the habitual style of the orator of the party, and even contained newspeak words. More newspeak words, indeed, than any party member would normally use in real life. And all the while, lest one should be in any doubt as to the reality which Goldstein's specious claptrap covered, behind his head on the telescreen there marched the endless columns of the Eurasian army, row after row of solid-looking men with expressionless Asiatic faces, who swam up to the surface of the screen and vanished, to be replaced by others exactly similar. The dull rhythmic tramp of the soldiers' boots formed the background to Goldstein's bleating voice. Before the hate had proceeded for 30 seconds, uncontrollable exclamations of rage were breaking out from half the people in the room. The self-satisfied sheep-like face on the screen, and the terrifying power of the Eurasian army behind it, were too much to be borne. Besides, the sight or even the thought of Goldstein produced fear and anger automatically.
I'm gonna go over with foundation, but...
He was an object of hatred more constant than either Eurasia or East Asia, since when Oceania was at war with one of these powers, it was generally at peace with the other. But what was strange was that although Goldstein was hated and despised by everybody, although every day and 1,000 times a day on platforms, on the telescreen, in newspapers, in books, his theories were refuted, smashed, ridiculed, held up to the general gaze for the pitiful rubbish that they were. In spite of all this, his influence never seemed to grow less. Always there were fresh dupes waiting to be seduced by him. A day never passed when spies and saboteurs acting under his directions were not unmasked by the thought police. He was the commander of a vast shadowy army, an underground network of conspirators dedicated to the overthrow of the state. The Brotherhood, its name was supposed to be. There were also whispered stories of a terrible book, a compendium of all the heresies, of which Goldstein was the author, and which circulated clandestinely here and there. It was a book without a title. People referred to it, if at all, simply as the book. But one knew of such things only through vague rumors. Neither the Brotherhood nor the book was a subject that any ordinary party member would mention, if there was a way of avoiding it. In its second minute, The hate rose to a frenzy. People were leaping up and down in their places and shouting at the tops of their voices.
Now the foundation I'm using is a mix of my like 15-year-old MAC and like a
sandy-haired
7-year-old
bright pink.
opening
and shutting like that.
Don't do what I'm doing.
Even O'Brien's heavy face was flushed. He was sitting very straight in his chair, his powerful chest swelling and quivering as though he were standing up to the assault of a wave.
I just didn't want to waste
the dark-haired girl behind Winston had begun crying out, "Swine! Swine! Swine!" And suddenly she picked up a heavy Newspeak dictionary and flung it at the screen. It struck Goldstein's nose and bounced off. The voice continued inexorably. In a lucid moment, Winston found that he was shouting with the others and kicking his heel violently against the rung of his chair. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but on the contrary, that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people, turning one even against one's will into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. Thus, at one moment, Winston's hatred was not turned against Goldstein at all, but on the contrary, against Big Brother, the party, and the thought police. And at such moments, his heart went out to the lonely, derided heretic on the screen, sole guardian of truth and sanity in a world of lies. And yet, the very next instant, he was at one with the people about him, and all that was said of Goldstein seemed to him to be true.
It is too hot in here.
At those moments, his secret loathing of Big Brother changed into adoration.
Adding a little extra
and Big Brother seemed to tower up, an invincible, fearless protector, standing like a rock against the hordes of Asia. And Goldstein, in spite of his isolation, his helplessness, and the doubt that hung about his very existence, seemed like some sinister enchanter, capable by the mere power of his voice of wrecking the structure of civilization. It was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort with which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare, Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian.
Entertainment purposes only.
He would ravish her and cut her throat to the moment of climax. Better than before, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because round her sweet, supple waist, what seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only the odious scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity.
Going in with
the hate rose to its climax. The voice of Goldstein had become an actual sheep's bleat, and for an instant, the face changed into that of a sheep. Then the sheep face melted into the figure of a Eurasian soldier, who seemed to be advancing, huge and terrible, his submachine gun roaring and seeming to spring out of the surface of the screen, so that some of the people in the front row actually flinched backwards in their seats. But in the same moment, drawing a deep sigh of relief from everybody, the hostile figure melted into the face of Big Brother. Black-haired, black-mustachioed, full of power and mysterious calm, and so vast that it almost filled up the screen. Nobody heard what Big Brother was saying. 'Twas merely a few words of encouragement, the sort of words that are uttered in the din of battle, not distinguishable individually, but restoring confidence by the fact of being spoken. Then the face of Big Brother faded away again, and instead, the three slogans of the party stood out in bold capitals.
Guess we can do some
War
Valentines
is
makeup.
peace. Freedom is slavery.
So for that, I am going to use the Selena
Ignorance is
Spooky
strength.
palette, but it's like what I have on me right now.
The face of Big Brother seemed to persist for several seconds on the screen, as though the impact that it had made on everyone's eyeballs was too vivid to wear off
Start
immediately.
with
The little sandy-haired woman had flung herself forward over the back
in the inner
in
corner.
front of her. With a tremulous murmur that sounded like, "My savior," she extended her arms towards the screen. Then she buried her face in her hands. It was apparent that she was uttering a prayer. At this moment, the entire group of people broke into a deep, slow, rhythmical chant of B, 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 over and over again, very slowly, with a long pause between the first B and the second. A heavy, murmurous sound, somehow curiously savage. In the
Next, we're
background,
going to go in a little bit of a darker one. That's on. Going to go on the other corner, and we're just going to layer that and then blend in.
For perhaps as much as 30 seconds, they kept it
A
up.
couple of other colors.
It was a refrain that was often heard in moments of overwhelming emotion. Partly, it was a sort of hymn to the wisdom and majesty of Big Brother. But still more, it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. Winston's entrails seemed to grow cold. In the 2 minutes' hate, he could not help sharing in the general delirium. But this subhuman chanting of B, 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 always filled him with horror. Of course, he chanted with the rest. It was impossible to do otherwise. To dissemble your feelings, to control your face, to do what everyone else was doing, was an instinctive reaction. But there was a space of a couple of seconds during which the expression of his eyes might conceivably have betrayed him. And it was exactly at this moment that the significant thing happened, if indeed it did happen. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles and was in the act of resettling them on his nose with his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of a second when their eyes met, and for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew, yes, he knew, that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as himself. Unmistakable message had passed. It was as though their two minds had opened, and the thoughts were flowing from one into the other through their eyes. "I am with you," O'Brien seemed to be saying to him. "I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust. But don't worry, I am on your side." And then the flash of intelligence was gone, and O'Brien's face was as inscrutable as everybody else's.
I'm going to go in with the same color that I used for my blush next.
That was all, and he was already uncertain whether it had happened. Such incidents never had any sequel. All that they did was to keep alive in him the belief or hope that others besides himself were the enemies of the party. Perhaps the rumors of vast underground conspiracies were true after all. Perhaps the Brotherhood really existed. It was impossible, in spite of the endless arrests and confessions and executions, to be sure that the Brotherhood was not simply a myth. Some days he believed in it, some days not. There was no evidence, only fleeting glimpses that might mean anything or nothing. Snatches of overheard conversation, faint scribbles on lavatory walls.
Thanks for coming in.
When two strangers met, a small movement of the hand which had looked as though it might be a signal of recognition. It was all guesswork. Very likely he had imagined everything. He had gone back to his cubicle without looking at O'Brien again. The idea of following up their momentary contact hardly crossed his mind. It would have been inconceivably dangerous, even if he had known how to set about doing it. For a second, 2 seconds, they had exchanged an equivocal glance, and that was the end of the story. But even that was a memorable event, in the locked loneliness in which one had to live. Winston roused himself and sat up straighter. He let out a belch. The gin was rising from his stomach. His eyes refocused on the page. He discovered that while he sat helplessly musing, he had also been writing, as though by automatic action. And it was no longer the same cramped, awkward handwriting as before. His pen had slid voluptuously over the smooth paper, printing in large, neat capitals, "Down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother, down with Big Brother," over and over again, filling half a page. He could not help feeling a twinge of panic. It was absurd, since the writing of those particular words was not more dangerous than the initial act of opening the diary, but for a moment he was tempted to tear out the spoiled pages and abandon the enterprise altogether. He did not do so, however, because he knew that it was useless. Whether he wrote "Down with Big Brother" or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him just the same. He had committed, would still have committed, even if he had never set pen to paper, the essential crime that contained all others in itself. Thought crime, they called it. Thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later they were bound to get you. It was always at night. The arrests invariably happened at night. The sudden jerk out of sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulder, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces round the bed. In the vast majority of cases there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated. Vaporized was the usual word. For a moment he was seized by a kind of hysteria. He began writing in a hurried, untidy scrawl. "They'll shoot me, I don't care. They'll shoot me in the back of the neck, I don't care. Down with Big Brother. They always shoot you in the back of the neck, I don't care. Down with Big Brother." Sat back in his chair, slightly ashamed of himself, and laid down the pen. The next moment he started violently. There was a knocking at the door. Already. He sat as still as a mouse, in a futile hope that whoever it was might go away after a single attempt. But no, the knocking was repeated. The worst thing of all would be to delay. His heart was thumping like a drum, but his face, from long habit, was probably expressionless. He got up and moved heavily towards the door. Chapter 2. As he put his hand to the doorknob, Winston saw that he had left the diary open on the table. "Down with Big Brother" was written all over it, in letters almost big enough to be legible across the room. It was an inconceivably stupid thing to have done. But, he realized, even in his panic, he had not wanted to smudge the creamy paper by shutting the book, while the ink was wet. He drew in his breath and opened the door. Instantly a warm wave of relief flowed through him. A colorless, crushed-looking woman, with wispy hair and a lined face, was standing outside. "Oh, comrade," she began in a dreary, whining sort of voice. "I thought I heard you come in. Do you think that you could come across and have a look at our kitchen sink? It's got blocked up and—" It was Mrs. Parsons, the wife of a neighbor on the same floor, Mrs. was a word somewhat discountenanced by the party. You were supposed to call everyone comrade, but with some women one used it instinctively. She was a woman of about 30, but looking much older. One had the impression that there was dust in the creases of her face. Winston followed her down the passage. These amateur repair jobs were an almost daily irritation. Victory Mansions were old flats, built in 1930 or thereabouts, and were falling to pieces. The plaster flaked constantly from the ceilings and walls. The pipes burst in every hard frost. The roof leaked whenever there was snow. The heating system was usually running at half steam, when it was not closed down altogether for motives of economy. Repairs, except what you could do for yourself, had to be sanctioned by remote committees, which were liable to hold up even the mending of a window pane to 2 years. "Of course, it's only because Tom isn't home," said Mrs. Parsons vaguely. The Parsons flat was bigger than Winston's, and dingy in a different way. Everything had a battered, trampled-on look, as though the place had just been visited by some large, violent animal. Games impedimenta, hockey sticks, boxing gloves, a burst football, a pair of sweaty shorts turned inside out,
mascara,
all over the floor,
$6.
and on the table there was a litter of dirty dishes and dog-eared exercise books.
From some place called Miniso.
On the walls were scarlet banners of the Youth League and the Spies, and a full-sized poster of Big Brother. There was the usual boiled cabbage smell common to the whole building, but it was shot through by a sharper reek of sweat, which, one knew this at the first sniff, though it was hard to say how, was the sweat of some person not present at the moment. In another room, someone with a comb and a piece of toilet paper was trying to keep tune with the military music which was slowly showing from the telescreen.
It would look so nice.
"It's the children," said Mrs. Parsons, casting a half-apprehensive glance at the door. "They haven't been out today, and of course—" She had a habit of breaking off her sentences in the middle. The kitchen sink was full nearly to the brim with filthy greenish water, which smelled worse than ever of cabbage. Winston knelt down and examined the angle joint of the pipe. He hated using his hands, and he hated bending down, which was always liable to start him coughing. Mrs. Parsons looked on helplessly. "Of course, if Tom was home, he'd put it right in a moment," she said. "He loves anything like that. He's ever so good with his hands, Tom is." Parsons was Winston's fellow employee at the Ministry of Truth. He was a fattish but active man of paralyzing stupidity, a mass of imbecile enthusiasms, one of those completely unquestioning, devoted drudges, on whom, more even than on the thought police, the stability of the party depended. At 35, he had just been unwillingly evicted from the Youth League, and before graduating into the Youth League, he had managed to stay on in the Spies for a year.
Illuminati multi-chrome gel eyeliner.
At the ministry, he was employed in some subordinate post for which intelligence was not required. But on the other hand, he was a leading figure on a sports committee, and all the other committees engaged in organizing community hikes, spontaneous demonstrations, savings campaigns, and voluntary activities generally. He would inform you with quiet pride, between whiffs of his pipe, that he had put in an appearance at the community center every evening for the past 4 years. An overpowering smell of sweat, a sort of unconscious testimony to the strenuousness of his life, followed him about wherever he went, and he remained behind him after he had gone. "Have you got a spanner?" said Winston, fiddling with the nut in the angle joint. "A spanner?" said Mrs. Parsons, immediately becoming invertebrate. "I don't know, I'm sure. Perhaps the children." There was a trampling of boots and another blast on the comb as the children charged into the living room. Mrs. Parsons brought the spanner.
Pencil type.
Winston let out the water and disgustedly removed the clot of human hair that had blocked up the pipe. He cleaned his fingers as best he could in the cold water from the tap and went back into the other room. "Up with your hands!" yelled a savage voice. A handsome, tough-looking boy of 9 had popped up from behind the table and was menacing him with a toy automatic pistol, while his small sister, about 2 years younger, made the same gesture with a fragment of wood. Both of them were dressed in the blue shorts, grey shirts, and red neckerchiefs, which were the uniform of the spies. Winston raised his hands above his head, but with an uneasy feeling, so vicious was the boy's demeanor, that it was not altogether a game. "A traitor!" yelled the boy. "You're a thought criminal! You're a Eurasian spy! I'll shoot you, or vaporize you, or send you to the salt mines!" Suddenly, they were both leaping round him, shouting, "Traitor!" and "Thought criminal!" the little girl imitating her brother at every movement. It was somehow slightly frightening, like the gambolling of tiger cubs, which will soon grow up into man-eaters. There was a sort of calculating ferocity in the boy's eye, a quite evident desire to hit or kick Winston, and a consciousness of being very nearly big enough to do so. It was a good job it was not a real pistol he was holding, Winston thought. Miss Parsons' eyes flitted nervously from Winston to the children, and back again. In the better light of the living room, he noticed with interest that there actually was dust in the creases of her face. "They do get so noisy," she said. "They're disappointed because they couldn't go to see the hanging. That's what it is. I'm too busy to take them, and Tom won't be back from work in time." "Why can't we go and see the hanging?" roared the boy in his huge voice.
Should have done this on fucking YouTube.
"To see the hanging! Want to see the hanging!" chanted the little girl, still capering.
This is why I'm done with TikTok.
Eurasian prisoners, guilty of war crimes, were to be hanged in the park that evening, Winston remembered. This happened about once a month, and was a popular spectacle. Children always clamored to be taken to see it. He took his leave of Mrs. Parsons and made for the door, but he had not gone 6 steps down the passage when something hit the back of his neck in an agonizingly painful blow. It was as though a red-hot wire had been jabbed into him. He spun round just in time to see Mrs. Parsons dragging her son back into the doorway, while the boy pocketed a catapult. "Goldstein!" bellowed the boy as the door closed on him. What most struck Winston was the look of helpless fright on the woman's greyish face. Picking a flat, he stepped quickly past the telescreen and sat down at the table again, still rubbing his neck. The music from the telescreen had stopped. Instead, a clipped military vertical reading out, with a sort of brutal relish, a description of the armaments of the new floating fortress, to just be anchored between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Those children, he thought, that wretched woman must lead a life of terror. Another year, 2 years, and they would be watching her night and day for symptoms of unorthodoxy. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was worst of all was that by means of such organizations as the spies, they were systematically turned into ungovernable little savages, and yet this produced in them no tendency whatever to rebel against the discipline of the party. On the contrary, they adored the party and everything connected with it. The songs, the processions, the banners, the hiking, the drilling of dummy rifles, the yelling of slogans, the worship of Big Brother. It was all a sort of glorious game to them. All their ferocity was turned outwards, against the enemies of the state, against foreigners, traitors, saboteurs, thought criminals. It was almost normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children. With good reason, for hardly a week passed in which the Times did not carry a paragraph describing how some eavesdropping little sneak, child hero was the phrase generally used, had overheard some compromising remark and denounced its parents to the thought police. The sting of the catapult bullet had worn off. He picked up his pen half-heartedly, wondering whether he could find something more to write in the diary. Suddenly he began thinking of O'Brien again. Years ago, how long was it? 7 years it must be. He had dreamed that he was walking through a pitch-dark room, and someone sitting to one side of him had said as he passed, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness." It was said very quietly, almost casually.
Oh,
A statement, not a command.
God.
He had walked on without pausing. What was curious was that at the time in the dream, the words had not made much impression on him. It was only later and by degrees that they had seemed to take on significance.
Sucks.
He could not now remember whether it was before or after having the dream that he had seen O'Brien for the first time. Nor could he remember when he had first identified the voice as O'Brien's. But at any rate, the identification existed. It was O'Brien who had spoken to him out of the dark. Winston had never been able to feel sure. Even after this morning's flash of the eyes, it was still impossible to be sure whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy. Nor did it even seem to matter greatly. There was a link of understanding between them, more important than affection or partisanship. "We shall meet in a place where there is no darkness," he had said. Winston did not know what it meant, only that in some way or another it would come true. The voice from the telescreen paused. A trumpet call, clear and beautiful, floated into the stagnant air. The voice continued raspingly. "Attention. Your attention, please. A news flash has this moment arrived from the Malabar front. Our forces in South India have won a glorious victory. I am authorized to say that the action we are now reporting may well bring the war within measurable distance of its end. Here is the news flash." Bad news coming, thought Winston. And sure enough, following on a gory description of the annihilation of a Eurasian army, with stupendous figures of killed and prisoners, came the announcement that, as from next week, the chocolate ration would be reduced from 30 grams to 20. Winston belched again. The gin was wearing off, leaving a deflated feeling. The telescreen, perhaps to celebrate the victory, perhaps to drown memory of the lost chocolate, crashed into "Oceania, 'tis for thee." You were supposed to stand to attention. However, in his present position he was invisible. "Oceania, 'tis for thee" gave way to lighter music,